Along with thinking I could read a book and easily teach my children how to sleep well, I also spent my first pregnancy reading up on how to teach my kids to be amazing eaters. My husband and I are people who love to eat all the things. And we had grand plans of our kids happily eating food off the adult menu at fine dining establishments. Having two children 18 months apart, however, helped me quickly learn that the best laid plans will work for some children and not others. Addison was not by the book with sleep, and ultimately she inspired this business, but she got on board with my eating plan pretty darn quickly. I remember having friends visit when she was a toddler, and they were floored by what she would eat at a high end restaurant. My confidence was high when my second daughter prepared to start solids, but she quickly humbled me. She might have been willing to sleep through the night at 8 weeks, but she was unwilling to eat any of my homemade purees. She would only eat a handful of things as she entered preschool, most of them unhealthy. When I met today's guest at an event, I quickly purchased her program, and my extremely picky eater is now my most adventurous eater. Alisha Grogan is a pediatric occupational therapist who helps parents who have picky eaters. If you don't already know her, I am extremely excited to introduce her to you. If you listen to today's episode and are interested in learning more, please visit the show notes where I'll link to her free workshop on 3 keys to finally turn your picky eater around. Hi, I'm Allison Egidi, a pediatric sleep and wellness coach and a mom of two. I love to help parents find solutions. This is How Long Till Bedtime. Hi, Alisha. Thanks for joining me today. I'm really excited to be chatting with you. I have tons of parents that I work with who are often expressing concern around their children's eating because obviously dinner comes before sleep. And so I get lots of questions about eating as it relates to sleep. And you have helped me personally, and I'm really excited for my audience to get to know you. So, for those in my audience who don't know you, I would love for you to share a little bit about yourself.
Great. Thanks so much, Allison. I am so excited to be here. Well, I'm a pediatric occupational therapist, and I spent many years working with children 0 to 3 years old in their home, so in an early intervention program. And I worked in schools and some outpatient settings. And then in 2011, I started yourkidstable.com to share all of my special tips and tricks as an OT that I really felt like parents needed to know, and the stuff nobody was really telling them, specifically about feeding and sensory processing, which ended up being my two specialties because as I started working with young children, I found that most of my caseload was filled with children that were struggling to have a variety of foods. Parents were really concerned about what they were eating. So I tried every strategy out there, took tons of classes, practiced with hundreds of kids, and was really able to see patterns emerge of what worked and saw that continue as I started Your Kids Table and then working with thousands of families around the world and watching these strategies that can really make a huge difference in a child's relationship with food, not just like at dinner time tonight, but really have an impact on their relationship with food throughout the rest of their life.
And did you niche down into this kind of specific focus before or after having kids? I always love to hear what kind of drove people to this area.
Well, it was way before I had kids, and it was uh I sort of had a choice to make because I had all of these kids on my caseload that were struggling with how much food they were eating, were not eating well, and This is a specialty within occupational therapy. So I honestly had not learned a lot about it in graduate school, unfortunately. And as most OTs don't. It's just not part of the education process. So I really had to learn a lot because I was sitting in families' homes, uh, watching them cry, watching them be pushed to the end of reason because they were so stressed that their child wasn't eating. And even though I wasn't a parent yet, my job as an occupational therapist was to be there to help them. And this, hands down, out of all of the different things that occupational therapists can help a child with, this was the most stressful thing that I saw parents trying to figure out. And I actually had a little girl on my caseload. She was 2 years old and she was the cutest little thing. And she had a diagnosis of what's called failure to thrive, which means she just wasn't eating a lot. And they're just doctors at that time didn't really know what else to say. So they're just like, well, she's not eating, so she's failing to thrive, which makes parents feel terrible. I mean, it's just like nobody wants their hear their kid is failing to thrive. And I didn't know a lot. I talked to my mentor, my boss, uh, tried to pick the brain of a couple of other therapists I worked with. And, we had these like kind of basic tips that we were using, but it wasn't really helping her. She got discharged off of my caseload, and it was the most horrible feeling because I'd worked with her for a few months and I thought, well, not a lot has changed. And that was a moment for me where I decided I would not have another kid on my caseload and not know how to help them. So that changed everything. However, when I had my own children, I had a much deeper reality check of what it meant to live it 24 hours a day when my own child, my second child, was an extreme picky eater and had a lot of feeding difficulties really early on. And even though I knew what to do at that point, because I had become an expert in picky eating and eating difficulties, it hit me on a totally different level, and really, quite frankly, brought me to my knees in tears because of the stress that it was trying to feed a child 3 or 4 times a day that wasn't really eating very much.
Yes, I actually have a similar sort of story, which ultimately led me to you. But my oldest would eat anything, and I am a planner. And so before she was born, I had decided I was going to do all homemade food and all the things. And she just took to it so quickly, and she was open to trying all my crazy recipes with all the real foods. And then my second came around, and I thought, well, all you have to do is the right things, which is introducing them to real food, and she immediately refused my homemade baby food. She had zero interest in eating it. And out of desperation, one day my husband gave her some jarred food and she ate it right up. And I thought that's so weird. And so I tasted it. And I remember thinking, it's so gross. It doesn't taste like any real food that I know of, but it was all that she would eat. And so we did that for a while. But then obviously, eventually, you're not eating these jarred baby foods. And she was super, super picky. And then we happened to meet, and I've ended up buying your course, and it was really helpful to get her on a new path. And now she's 7 and she tries all the things, which is great. But I really did feel a little bit desperate because I thought I was doing the right things, and she just would not eat real food. Um, so on that topic, and I learned this from you, and you mentioned before we hopped on that there's even a new definition, but can you define what it is to have a picky eater and if there are varying levels of picky eating?
Yes, this is such a good question, and I think is so helpful for every parent to know because we use the term picky eating very subjectively and very broadly. So, some people will describe a picky eater as a child that just doesn't like their broccoli, and other people are describing that their child that only eats 3 foods total in their diet and gags or has a flip out at the table if there's anything new near their plate. Both somehow are a picky eater, but that's not really true. So, what we're looking at now, as there is a new diagnosis that just came out in October of this year, is that there are some children that have a harder time eating new foods not because of something parents are doing, not because they're not feeding them the right foods. It's because there are some underlying difficulties that are making it difficult for them to eat. So I have previously called this extreme picky eaters, and different therapists use different terms for this. So therapists historically have kind of known about this distinction, but we haven't had really clear language around it. Now we have this new diagnosis, which is called pediatric feeding disorder. And that line that they have drawn is if a child is eating 20 or less foods and they are having difficulty either chewing the food, they're having difficulty with the textures of the food. So, they might like just crunchy food, or they might really need just soft food, or there could potentially be a medical issue like reflux, or a food sensitivity or a food allergy that is unknown yet, but it is, causing them discomfort, and they are kind of kind of narrowing down what they're eating. Now, beyond that, there are kids that will eat 20 to like 30-ish, 35 foods. I mean, it is still quite a range on that end. We're just considering that child to be an average picky eater. Those kids are usually eating a decent variety of food, but they may like the classic kid foods. Those are kids that love chicken nuggets and macaroni and cheese, and they'll usually eat a variety of them. They're not particular about it has to be this brand of chicken nuggets or I'm not eating it, which a child with pediatric feeding disorder would be. So they would eat one specific brand or maybe two specific brands, or it can't be this way or it can't be cut that way. There's kind of all of these rules around the food because a child is trying to protect themselves when they're in this more extreme category. An average picky eater might not love their vegetables, but they have a decent range of food. They usually don't have big emotional reactions. They don't gag or even throw up at new foods, which does happen for kids with pediatric feeding disorder or these kind of more extreme picky eaters.
So interestingly enough, my oldest, who would try anything, she did have the gag and vomit situation, but she would still try things. But she would. I remember the first time we gave her eggs. We happened to be in a restaurant, and she vomited all over the floor. And so I initially thought she was choking, and then they did some tests in the pediatrician's office where we could see the food, and they said, no, no, she's not choking. She's just very responsive to the texture of the food, and she ultimately got over it. My picky eater did not have the gag reflex, but she did do what you're saying. And she still does do this a little bit. There are certain chicken tenders she would like. She's very specific, down to what bun she would eat for a burger. She has niched down into her types of food she likes or brands she likes, but she will try new things, at least at this point, which I feel like was a good accomplishment for her. One thing I'm curious about is there anything that parents can do in the early months of introducing foods that can help set kids up to not be a picky eater? Or is it that's who they are because of all the things you just mentioned? They may have these other struggles that have nothing to do with what the parents are doing. But are there things that you would say when you're introducing foods early on that could potentially help you avoid having an extremely picky eater?
Absolutely. So while there are some factors that will make it difficult to fight against, for instance, if your child has really bad reflux and they are not, it could be silent reflux. So you don't see it coming out, but it's going halfway up their throat and it's going right back down. And that can be difficult to diagnose or to realize what's going on. That's a very specific example, but it is common, especially around that age. So even if you do these things, it could help, but it might not get you over the hurdle enough, which is why I think it's so important to always be really expressing your concerns with your doctor. This new diagnosis does help a lot with that because we have seen, and what I have heard from literally thousands of parents is, I told my doctor and they told me to just wait. And that works sometimes, but we know that around 40% of kids that have this more extreme picky eating, they are not going to outgrow it on their own. And this really can turn into lifelong struggles. So we have regular comments on your kids' table from adults saying, I wish somebody had helped me when I was a kid. So it is real and it does continue. Teens and adults definitely continue to struggle with this. Not all kids are going to outgrow it. However, uh, some will, especially when, and most will that are in this kind of milder category. To get to your question, if you're putting food down in front of your child at an early age, one of the best things that you can do is allowing them to get messy, allowing them to play and explore with their food, giving them large pieces of food that are safe for them to eat. They actually can't get any food off of. For instance, to give a 6-month-old a whole carrot that is completely peeled, because they can kind of just mouth on it, get used to a texture. They desensitize their gag reflex by having something in their mouth so that their gag reflex doesn't trigger so easily. They get used to different textures when they're touching and playing. So I always want to put a little bit of baby food on their plate and let them try to bring it to their mouth or have their stick their hand in it and have them lick it off their hand. The more that you can expose them to different things, it will really help them with that texture piece, which is probably what your older daughter was struggling with a little bit. There's just this, like you said, the texture, and that was what we would call a cookie swallow that she had done. So they can actually see it on the x-ray, the food and how the food is moving around in their mouth. So that was a sensory response that she was having because the texture was difficult. However, it sounds like you kept giving it to her, which a lot of times parents, that happens and they're scared that they're going to choke, and it's really just a gag, which is very different than choking. And so they stop giving them that food. They just take it away, and then they become very aware that, well, they might choke on that because it's a similar texture. And what happens is the child doesn't get exposed to it. So that sensitivity just grows bigger instead of getting smaller. So the more that you can expose them to things, if you see your child gag on something or they're like, or they shudder, that's the more I want to give it to them, especially when they're babies and toddlers, to help them get used to it. The older they get, it's possible, but it definitely takes more time because those connections in their brain are kind of set in their way and they start to understand a lot more. They kind of come up with all these associations with food. So again, possible to break down when kids are older, but it is more challenging and takes some more time.
I was lucky because her pediatrician, her interest is in food and nutrition, so she has some additional education, which I know not all pediatricians do. And so once she could show me that she wasn't actually choking, and she had said exactly like you said, keep giving her the food. I have no idea if this is what you would recommend, but she said allow her to spit it out if she decides it's not good. So she said, go ahead and let her spit it out. I know that's not what old school parenting is, where you encourage kids to spit something into the napkin, but let her spit it out, but keep giving it to her. And then we did that, I mean, really into toddlerhood. And then at some point we said, okay, we don't need to spit things out anymore because you've outgrown this. And but if it weren't for my pediatrician, I probably would have been very uncomfortable continuing to give her these foods because she would vomit just because she'd be gagging and gagging and then vomit, but she wasn't actually choking.
Sure. That is very common for me to see because you're just hitting that gag reflex. And for some kids, it happens really quick. Like they have such a sensitive gag reflex. And then that becomes your stomach also gets very used to kind of contracting and making it throw up. Like it's like uh, it's kind of happening automatically. Like once kids start to do it so many times. So you are so fortunate that you had that pediatrician because uh, I'm constantly hearing from parents the opposite because they have come to me because they have waited and not seen the results, and that is the most common advice that pediatricians give, and most don't have that extra training. They don't get any training. What pediatricians are looking at is to make sure that your child is on the growth chart. They're looking for a nice pretty arc on the growth chart, which is important, but the problem is some picky eaters are eating enough of their three foods that they're still putting on the weight, but it's still this huge stress at home. And parents usually know. Parents usually have a very gut instinct that, okay, the pediatrician is telling me that it's okay, but this doesn't feel right. This doesn't feel right that they're only eating five foods or that meal times are such a battle. And those problems usually don't just go away.
Right. And once you realize that you have a picky eater, or your gut is telling you this isn't right, what is the best age to really start helping them over, kind of get over this hurdle?
As soon as possible. The earlier that you can help them, the better, but there is no age that is too late. We have students, although I created the program Mealtime Works to help kids that are in this kind of extreme picky eating category or just really struggling with picky eating, we had designed it for children 1 to 12 years old, but we have had several students take it with teenagers, and it's still able to help them. Again, it just takes more time, but the sooner you can help them, the quicker you will likely see results. But it's really important to kind of work towards pulling back what's making it difficult for them. So for again, for your daughter, it was, the older daughter in particular, it was like the texture issue. For some children, it is an age thing. It's normal part of development for children between 1 and 2 years old to start average picky eating. So they usually get more selective about their vegetables. Foods taste much more bitter to them than they do to us. It's part of their taste bud development. So while they may have eaten vegetables ravenously as a baby when you were spooning it into their mouth, by 18 months old, their taste buds have sharpened very significantly, and then they start to dull again. While they're in that age range, they start to not want to eat those vegetables because they are so excessively bitter tasting to them. They also are going through an independent stage, and eating is one of the few areas that they can control. So they also very poor attention, and they don't want to be sitting at the table. They want to be up and like moving around and doing whatever. So all of these factors kind of combine that around 1 to 2 years old, kids will usually enter a typical picky eating phase, and it can last just for a year or two, but it can go all the way up to 5 years old. So it's so important to kind of hold on to, what I would consider foundational strategies so that your child does naturally grow out of these kind of picky eating habits that they're in, because otherwise it can really snowball and they can get much bigger, even if it's just kind of this average picky eating phase that your child is in.
On the vegetable front, I definitely have some moms in my membership group who were interested in hearing your thoughts on eating vegetables. And one question they had specifically was around hiding the vegetables. So, sneaking them in to food in another way. I mean, I remember I used to hide spinach and scrambled eggs back in the day. And so is the reason I'm kind of curious now that based on what you just said, is the reason that's successful is because when you hide it in the food, it takes away some of that bitterness. And they were curious if you have thoughts on when should you be getting away from hiding the vegetable to sneak the vegetable into your child?
Sure. Well, I do not like sneaking vegetables at any age, but I think that there's a difference. There's a very big difference if you're making a 1-year-old and eggs or a muffin, and that's part of the recipe. They're not old enough to understand. Put them in there. I just wouldn't think of it as sneaking. Like, you're just maximizing the nutrition of that food by getting it in there and having a food. If you saute spinach or raw spinach would even be dangerous for a 1-year-old to eat. It could like get in their area. You have to mince it up really fine anyways and mix it in with something. That would be a really difficult food anyways for a child that age to eat. So I would want to be maximizing their nutrition. But at the same time, I also want to be exposing them to foods that are appropriate. So for young toddlers and babies, that's soft cooked vegetables. As they get older into like 2 to 3 years old, you can start to do some raw veggies, which a lot of picky eaters do better with because the texture isn't as intense. So doing matchstick like raw carrots is a great way because there's a little bit of crunch to them and they will respond to that better. So I love to head in the direction of raw veggies. I also love to focus on fruits because there are so many vitamins and nutrients in fruit, but they have those natural sugars in them that make them a lot more appeasing to children. So I think it gives a good buffer for parents to just have some peace. Like, they're having some fruits, they're getting good fiber, they're getting good nutrients. but that doesn't mean to not serve the vegetables. I would be serving them in the way that's appropriate for their age. And then I work towards, if a child is really picky and they're really not moving towards trying the vegetables, I will do things like breading the vegetables. I involve them in the recipes. And by the time they're old enough to understand, like let's say you have a favorite zucchini muffin and they love this muffin and they know the zucchini is in it, but you would really like to add that spinach in there to make it even healthier for them, even more nutritious. And you know that they might taste it or see it and get upset. That's when we don't want to hide it. If they are going to see it and be upset, we want to be honest with them and let them know either that it's in there or even better yet, have them help cook it. And you don't even have to make a big deal about it. So, it's just like you chop up the spinach and be like, oh, some spinach goes in here. And then they have this awareness of it. And even if they're like, whoa, I don't want spinach in there, it's like, well, we're going to try and mince up a little bit. We can put a little bit less in if you want. It's your choice if you eat it or not. So that's where we want to kind of leave it with kids, but we want them to see this food going in, because what happens is if we don't do that, we start to have them not trust us. So if they're old enough to understand that something can be in there, that is a classic way that children will narrow their foods even more, because they think who knows what mom has put in that. She said those are my regular muffins, but are they really? The last time she put spinach in here, so forget it. I'm not eating them anymore. And that happens all the time. So it's a very slippery slope. So I would maybe just change the way you think about it. Maybe not hiding vegetables, just maximizing nutrition until they're old enough to tell them about it.
And then telling them about it. That makes a lot of sense to me. So you mentioned letting kids get messy with their food as an early tip. I'm curious if you have any other tips, particularly for kids who are a little bit older, that would allow parents to just take an initial step towards helping their picky eater.
Yes, absolutely. I would say one of my best tips is to pay attention to when your child is eating. Often kids are eating frequently throughout the day. We give them a handful of goldfish while they're in the Target cart so that we can get done what we need to. Totally understandable. So no judgment on that part. But then we go home an hour later and we try to feed them lunch and they don't want to really eat. And this can seem even more frustrating if we're giving them a food that they typically eat or they eat sometimes, and now they're not eating it. It's very easy to jump to the conclusion of, oh my gosh, now they're not eating grilled cheese either. They're not eating grilled cheese. But what really happened was they filled up their stomach on that snack. And here's the problem. Most of us as adults, because of how we were raised, we can eat and eat and eat, and we overeat. We will eat past when we're full. We will eat when food is put in front of us, even if we're not that hungry, because we've learned to do that. It's time to eat, so we're going to eat. We will finish everything on our plate because we need to finish our plate because that's how we were raised. And I know it's not for everybody, but many, many of us were. Our child has not learned to do that yet. They are only going to eat when they feel hungry. And if a child finds eating difficult or they have something that they would rather do, all they need to do is take the edge off their appetite. And we all do this at times. So if you think about if you have a particularly busy day and you are finding yourself having to skip a meal, you will grab something, most likely, even if it's from a vending machine or while you're in that Target checkout, or you've thrown something into your purse and you're going to grab and eat something small, and you're able to make it all the way to the next meal because you've just taken the edge off of your appetite. And the appetite signals stop being sent to the brain. So when we let kids snack constantly, or we think maybe they'll eat more if we just like give them access to food all the time, it actually hurts their appetite in that moment, but it also decreases their awareness of appetite over time because they don't ever get a chance to actually feel hungry. So the recommendation is that children have 2.5 to 3 hours ish at least. It can be even longer. Some kids do great with a 4-hour break in between eating, especially as they get older. So if your child eats it 8 o'clock in the morning, they have breakfast. You're going to start that count from the time they start eating. And then you don't want to feed them anything but water, because even milk or juice can take that edge off their appetite until 2.5 to 3 hours later. So that would mean they would have a snack at 10:30, or maybe or even lunch, or they could have lunch at 11 o'clock. So somewhere around 10:30 or 11 o'clock, they would eat again. That way, you know that when they sit down, that their appetite is as primed as it possibly can be.
And what about those kids? So actually, my picky eater would love to snack all day. And so she's always telling me she's hungry. Obviously, I've been around and followed your advice, so I don't let her eat at random times. But what would you say to that child that's an hour later saying, but I'm hungry, or they didn't eat a good lunch, so maybe they actually are hungry an hour later?
Yeah, well, before they even get down from the table. So if I've noticed that a child doesn't, if one of my kids has not eaten well and they're like, I'm done, I say, okay, that's your choice, but is your stomach full? So I really try to get them to sit and think a minute about if their stomach is full. 9 out of 10 times they're going to say, yeah, because they want to go. They either want to go or they don't want to eat what's there. And then I say, are you going to make it until snack or lunch? And even if you're talking to a toddler here, I'm going to say, okay, no more food until lunch. No more food until lunch. Now, obviously, there'll be somewhat limited understanding. And sometimes you have to bend the rules a little bit with a toddler because they don't fully understand the concept of time. So you might need to make it a little bit earlier, but you want to make them feel like I've had to wait. I'm not just going to take a snack now, and that the meal has ended. Another thing that's really helpful is to sit down and eat with your children, because if you're eating with your children, you've now created a moment around the meal. So it's not like, hey, like they're sitting there and you've put a plate of food in front of them and you're doing the dishes, which I mean, I do this all the time. So I know that this, while you're trying to help your child get used to this appetite, it'd be really good to sit and eat with them for as many meals as you can, but at least one meal a day. Because when they say, oh, I'm done, you can say, oh, lunch isn't over yet. It's okay to expect a child to sit for up to 30 minutes for a meal. Now, that can go down. I know you have probably some listeners right now going, oh my gosh, there's no way my kids could sit for 30 minutes. And work up from where you are, because a lot of times if you just say to a child, well, lunch isn't over, it's your choice if you want to eat or not. So we're not putting pressure on them. We're not saying you have to eat, like eat all these bites, because that's just going to make them not want to do it. You just want to keep it casual and just say, well, we're all still having lunch and you don't have to eat anything else, but when lunch is over, you can get down. A lot of times kids will just start eating and get on their own because they're sitting there and they're not that full. So they will start eating. And then you can kind of say, once you've hit that 30 minutes, or if you're working towards 20 minutes or 15 minutes, you can say, okay, it's time to get down, and then go through the questions. And then I also like to have kids clean up their plate, even from a really early age, because it helps them understand this is the end of the meal. And then as they're done, I remind them again, okay, we're not eating again until lunch, until snack, whatever the next meal is that's coming.
Awesome. And on that note of kids not eating meals, I often hear about kids refusing dinner. And my picky eater refused dinner the most when she was younger, but even my adventurous eater would sometimes show zero interest. And still at almost 9, sometimes she'll do that. She just said, I don't want to eat dinner. And again, my pediatrician had reassured me that that's totally fine and that I didn't need to force them to eat dinner, and that missing a meal here or there is really a non-event. And the language we had used with them was, okay, well, when dinner's done, the kitchen is closed until breakfast, and that's it. So you don't have to eat it. Do you feel that way, that it's very typical for kids to occasionally completely skip a meal, like literally eat a bite or two and not eat anything else?
Yes, I do think it's normal for kids to do that. Again, they're following their own appetite signals, and especially for toddlers, their caloric needs go down significantly. So meaning, like, they do not need as many calories in a day at at 15 months as they did at 9 months, which seems perplexing because now they're older, but babies are growing at such a fast rate that they eat so much. They have to, because of the rate that their bodies are growing. Their growing significantly starts to slow down at 1 years old. So they don't need as many calories. So especially for toddlers and young preschoolers, it's very common to skip meals. However, I don't let kids say, I just don't want to eat, and then they go do whatever they want. They still need to come to the table, be part of the environment, and not have it be stressful. But again, in some cases, kids often will, they're sitting there, so they'll eat a little bit of their meal instead of just totally skipping it. And then there could be complaints later. So need to, like you said, say kitchen is closed until breakfast. In some cases, if it's affecting a child's sleep a lot, we will, do a bedtime snack, but we try to space that out as far away from dinner as possible, because otherwise kids will very quickly learn, I don't have to eat this dinner. They're just going to give me a snack later anyways.
Yeah, and I'm such an advocate of early bedtimes that the way I usually work with parents, we aren't going to have that time. It would be 30 minutes later after
Oh
dinner.
gosh.
So it's like,
Right.
okay, we got to wrap that up. And then you tell them the kitchen's closed, and the kids they adjust. I mean, I have parents transition away from the bedtime snack because they're doing exactly what you said. They refuse dinner altogether because they're anticipating that in 45 minutes, they're going to get a snack food right before bedtime. And typically parents will report back, you're right, when I removed the bedtime snack, dinner did improve. Not 7 days a week, but they started to
Right.
participate more in dinner. And you had touched on something that I was hoping to ask about, which was the common theme when we were kids was to eat everything on your plate. And I actually have very vivid memories of being told that I could not leave the dinner table until I cleaned my plate, specifically my green beans, which I hated as a kid, but I do love green beans now. And my parents still love to tell the story about finding out that I had been hiding green beans in this little beer mug slot of their old kitchen table, and I was stashing them in there once my dog refused to eat them. And I think generally our generation doesn't push that. I feel like for the most part, we're more educated on that. But I am curious your thoughts on that clean plate concept. Do you feel strongly that people really shouldn't congratulate a child when they just by coincidence clean their plate? What do you feel about the language we use around eating everything on your plate?
Yeah, I think it seems so subtle. And while I know the motivation comes from a good place, because it makes us feel good as parents when our children have eaten well. And there's nothing wrong with that. Like, I think it hits us on an instinctual level to have our children fill up their bellies and to be it just makes us feel really good as parents. Like we're doing this, like they're getting the nutrition that they need, they're getting the calories and the energy that they need. So it seems like such an innocent thing to say, wow, you did a great job cleaning your plate. But what this teaches children and what it has taught us is that even if you're full, to go ahead and finish that food, which teaches us to overeat and leads to weight and health problems in the long run that a lot of people struggle with, because there's just this constant subconscious motivation of I need to finish this plate that we learned as kids. So I want to take that out of the equation. I want to use language around eat till you're full. And I remember we had grandparents, despite what I do for a living, that would sometimes say that to my kids. And my kids would then say, they would just be with me, and I just a handful of times said to me as a kid, look, I finished everything. And I would kind of act like, oh, okay. Like, that like a little surprise. And I would say, well, I said, did you eat till you were full? And they said, they'd say yes. And I'd say, okay. I said, that's the most important thing, is that you eat until you're full. I said, if your belly feels full, that's great. And you can clean up if you can clean up if you want. So I kind of try to downplay it if one of my kids brought it up, and I try to avoid going there at all, so that they're instead listening to their own internal cues. And I know that some families get really worried about the food waste, which I totally understand. So my solution for that is serving them really small portions or allowing a child to serve themselves. And, and when they are taking food, saying to them, if they seem to be taking a lot and you're seriously questioning, are they really going to eat all this? To say, you can get more. Why don't you eat some of what you have first and then check in and see if you're still hungry and you can get more food.
The serving themselves was really big for my daughter, and this was something I learned from you, was to do the family style dinner and let her actually put the food onto her plate. And I think, gosh, this was years ago now, but I think it was she had to put a little bit of everything onto her plate, or I can't remember the exact dynamics of it. But I remember the very dinner she tried three new things, and that putting it onto her own plate seemed to be a big thing for her. And there were things she never touched, but she started to dabble in them more. But then my other daughter would want to put loads onto her plate. And so we had to constantly say, well, just a spoonful. And then if you eat it, you can have more. But I think that was one of the big turning points for her, was putting it on her plate versus us plating the food and giving it to her and then her being disgusted with everything that was on the plate.
Yeah, it's huge because it gives children a sense of that control that they really want, especially when something is uncomfortable or difficult for them. So they feel like they have some ownership over it and they can take a really small amount. So, I tell kids, like, just take 1 pea. You can just take 1 pea. So it's also not overwhelming to them. They are so much more likely to interact with the food when they've already plated it, because there's been a level of interaction there. They've had to look at the food, which they might not even do if you already have it plated. I mean, they literally won't look at this stuff because they don't want to see it or even think about eating it. But when they serve themselves, it forces an interaction, but it's putting them in control of it.
And you've mentioned a couple times the safe food, and you mentioned sometimes kids turning on their safe food because they're not hungry because maybe they've snacked recently. What are your thoughts of what you should do when you are putting down more foods for them to try? You are including the safe food and they refuse to eat any of it, including the safe food. You don't want us to offer another safe food at that point, do you? Or what are your thoughts about that?
I don't. So in some instances with really young toddlers, when you're kind of still figuring out what their preferences are, sometimes I will pull out another food, but I really try to go incognito with that, because as soon as a baby or toddler sees you going to the cupboard, they will learn very quickly that I just throw this off and they're going to go over to that box, they're going to go over to that cupboard and just pull something else out, and they'll keep playing that game just to see how much stuff you pull out. So you really want to try not to do that. So sometimes I'll have a backup of like something behind the centerpiece on the table, like, oh, here's something else. Again, just for really young toddlers. Generally speaking, no. If it's a food that your child eats 50% of the time or more, if you have served it and they do not eat it, then that is on them. So you're not being unfair by, putting all new foods down in front of them. This is something they have typically eaten and they're choosing not to eat it. They're just making a choice in that moment. And they will likely learn from it if they don't eat that food that they typically do eat. Now, if you consistently serve a food that they had been eating and you have made sure that they haven't snacked and you've served it now 5 or 6 times and they have just not touched it again, I probably wouldn't still consider that a preferred food, but I would not offer something else or pull it out after just 1 or 2 times of them refusing it.
That's super helpful. Well, this has been very informative, and I really appreciate you joining me. Can you tell everyone where they can find you?
Absolutely. So you can find us on yourkidstable.com. We have a weekly blog post and a newsletter there. I would love to have your listeners join me over there. We're also on Instagram and Facebook at Your Kids Table.
And I'll link to all of those things in the show notes. And I know I've mentioned it a few times today. I found your picky eating course incredibly helpful. Can you give a quick overview of that program?
Yes, so it's 5 steps that we walk you through on how to help your child every step of the way through really overcoming picky eating challenges. It's designed for parents and gives you tons of tools, resources, support, including my personal support and other occupational therapists on my team inside of a Facebook group where we can help you every step of the way with any other questions that are coming up along the way. But we really go through the structure and the routine, setting up a positive environment, then really getting to those underlying causes that I mentioned and how to address those. So you learn why your child is having a difficult time eating. And a lot of times it's addressing those outside of a meal, which takes away a ton of pressure. And then in our 4th step, you learn really specific strategies on how to increase variety to new foods. So we are also teaching you proactively how to add new foods into their diet without stressing them out, without stressing you out, so that you can feel really good about meal times and what your child is eating. And again, really importantly, that you're teaching them skills that are going to help them today and for the rest of their life, because what they learn about food right now really does stay with them and will inform their habits around food for the rest of their life.
Awesome. And I will definitely link to that program in the show notes as well. Well, thanks again for hopping on here today. And I hope I get to see you again in person soon.
I hope so too, Allison. It's been a pleasure. Thank you so much.
All right. Bye for now.
Bye.
Thank you for listening to How Long Till Bedtime. To learn how we can work together to improve your child's sleep, please visit sleepandwellnesscoach.com.